welcome to everybody. I see we have many of you from all around the world, as usual, our global audience, and it's a great pleasure for me to kick off the new series that we've just started at the beginning of this month on Digitalisation and Industry 4.0. Just in terms of context, our president set out a number of themes for the 2020 to 21 period. And this year, we've already had 5 or 6 months focusing on sustainability. And we're now moving into the autumn period here in Europe, where we are focusing on digitalisation and industry 4.0. So for the last 3 months of this year. And I think you'll agree that the president had very good foresight in choosing these two topics, because they are certainly sustainability and digitalisation have been very much in the forefront of even people outside the supply chain, but we'll hear more about that today. I am really pleased that we're kicking this off with Professor Dr. Rod Franklin from the Kühne Logistics University in Hamburg. And I welcome Rod. Rod, you will have seen on our pre-publicity in terms of his extensive experience, both in supply chain management positions and in the academic world. And Rod's colleague, Professor Alan McKinnon, kicked off our sustainability series. So it's really appropriate that we've asked Rod to talk to us today and kick us off successfully on our journey really in digitalisation. There's certainly many topics out there. Rod will cover, give us a very good introduction, I'm sure, and start our thinking really within the Chartered Institute of Logistics and Transport. And there are, as we'll cover at the end, a number of other events, a number of other interviews, and lots of material that we will be providing over the coming months. So I think that's enough from me. I'm going to hand over to Rod. Rod will make a presentation for about 45 minutes. We've then got ample opportunity for me to ask him some of your questions. So I have got a few questions myself, but I don't really want to use those. I'd much rather use the Q&A function that with you feeding those questions in. So as Jasper has said, please, as we go and as you think of things, please feed in those questions, and then Rod and I will have probably about 30 minutes to talk through some of the topics that you have raised. So that is all from me. If I can hand over now to Rod, and thank you so much, Rod, for joining us today.
Well, thank you, Keith. I appreciate the opportunity to talk to the audience about a topic that, as you pointed out, is very, very important and becoming actually more important as we move forward. And it's a topic that is very much actually integrated with your original series of the environment, because digital technologies are recognized as potential aids in helping supply chain managers improve the efficiency and therefore the environmental footprint of their supply chains. As a welcome to all of you out there in the cyber world who are viewing this, I truly do appreciate your interest in the topic and hope that you will attend some of the follow-on sessions that are presented, because obviously in this format, I can only cover a few of the very, very important emerging concepts that will be facing all of you over the next 10 years. So keep that in mind. I'm going to share my screen and bring up my presentation, and hopefully you will have no problem seeing it. So what I'm going to focus on today is, where's the supply chain going to head in the future, particularly in the next 10 years? We get too far out, then the projections are much, much more opinions rather than actual fact-based or analyzed opportunities. So let's take a look and see what's happening and see if where we are heading sort of links to your thoughts on this. And if they don't, ask questions and we'll see why we have a gap. Or if you really think that I'm missing something, bring that up as well. All right. To take a stand here to project into the future, we here at KLU look at the dynamics occurring around business to understand what are the business drivers that are going to have industry adopt technology. We don't look at technology being adopted by industry as, let's call it a science experiment. Industry is very pragmatic and it adopts technologies based upon need, not hype. That's probably not what the vendors like to hear. But if we just take a look at the most recent hype cycle of RFID that started at the turn of this century, where it was going to revolutionize everything and then move fast forward to where we are today, we understand that perhaps all of that hype, while interesting to get knowledge out into the marketplace, doesn't necessarily translate into the pragmatic decisions being made in industry. So keep that in mind. When I look out into the future, I see a series of trends that really are driving the need for change in supply chain. Globalization, we've talked about this for many years, but it is still a factor that is a primary driver of need for change in supply chains. And that's because the supply chains have become extremely long. For many years, a little bit of stability has driven the idea of just-in-time supply chains. And now with the pandemic and some of the environmental risks that are going on, we're seeing people reevaluate these long global supply chains. And that means there's going to be a dynamic in globalization that has an impact that digitalization can potentially help. Demographics. We're all getting to be older in the Western world. I like to say people are beginning to look like me, which makes me feel good. But at the same time, that has an impact on supply chains in the Western world. We're also seeing in the emerging economies, Africa, Southeast Asia, South America, a much younger population. And that has another dynamic on supply chains. And again, potentially being aided by digital technologies, industry today can address those changing dynamics from a demographics perspective. We're looking at urbanization. In the next 10 years, over 60% of the population of the world will live in urban centers. That's quite different than the world was when I was born, where more than 50% of the population lived in the rural world. Urbanization creates huge problems for supply chains because of the density of people, congestion-related issues, as well as emissions-related issues. And here again, digitalization can have a positive impact. Global warming, you've already had a series of sessions on the environmental impact of supply chains, but global warming is another area that's going to create risks and therefore dynamics in how we manage our supply chains. And once more, digital technologies can aid in that area. Pollution, we see plastics in the ocean, we see our landfills becoming overfilled. what do we do with all the waste? More importantly, what do we do with all of the packaging waste that e-commerce is creating, and how do we handle that? Well, again, we can see potential opportunities for digital technologies to help. And finally, we see a change in the political structure of the world, where in the past we had, in the 60s and 70s, we had the Cold War, the 80s, it began to fall apart, and we had then a single dominant structure in the 90s and 2000s. Today, we're going to see again a much, much more multipolar world, and that has an impact as well on how supply chains get managed and the work that we have to do from a supply chain management perspective, from looking at visibility and risk control. And again, digital technologies coming in to help us out. So these issues are drawing into question a number of taken for granted business assumptions. We've been for many years looking at labor arbitrage. So people migrated to the Far East. We looked for low-cost labor in China. China now is beginning to rise up in its labor rates. So people are beginning to look at other Southeast Asian countries. But we're also starting to see migration to Africa, to South America, diversification in this whole area. So there's another issue that's coming up. So we're taking for granted concepts and moving them to the side. Companies used to think they were too big to fail, but we've demonstrated that that's not necessarily the case. And a lot of disruptors are out there using digital technologies to disrupt various aspects of industry. The concept that we can always find someone to do the work is beginning, at least in the Western world, where demographics are making people older. It's coming into question whether or not we can always find some people to do the work, if you will. We're already in the European market, as well as in the North American market, seeing a very difficult time in finding long-haul truck drivers. We are also seeing a difficult time in finding warehouse personnel. So we're going to see this get worse into the future, and we have to somehow address that issue. Trade barriers are again beginning to be erected, and we have to somehow anticipate what's going on and figure out how to work underneath this new set of trading regimes that we are beginning to see. Oil, energy in general is becoming a situation where we have to worry because of greenhouse gas emissions and many other aspects of our business world are coming into question because change is in the air, and we have to change or we're going to go the way of the dinosaur. So this is becoming a very positive motivator for companies that for years have been what I would call traditionalists and said, hey, we've done this for many, many years this way and we're quite successful. Why should we change? Now they're starting to question that assumption. If we look at technology, and you're going to probably see that I'm missing some of your favorite hyped technologies. Well, I'm sorry about that. But these 6 technologies or 6 trends in technical development are the ones that we are closely monitoring, if you will, that are going to have the next major impact here on supply chain operations. So, computing power. Over the last 50 years, computers have just increased exponentially in their ability to do computations. We are talking about today maybe seeing Moore's law, which is the doubling every 18 months in computing power, perhaps coming up against a barrier. But at the same time, we're starting to see quantum computing beginning to look like maybe it can actually come into commercialization. And by the end of this decade, we here at KLU firmly believe quantum computing will be a reality. So the computing dynamic, more and more power, is going to continue. And that is really enabling just about everything else that we are seeing in the digital world. We're seeing advances in communication technology. So 5G, they're already working on 6G. We've seen Wi-Fi 6.0 now, beginning to come out. Bluetooth 6.0. We're seeing lots and lots of new technologies here for communications, increasing the amount of information we can pass, the speed at which we can pass it, and also the actual ubiquity, if you will, where we can actually connect. It's becoming just everywhere, which is fantastic for controlling supply chains and has a major impact on what we can see over the next 10 years. Cloud-based computing. I have to say, back in the late 1990s, I worked in Silicon Valley and began 3 different startups. The problem that we had was that we ended up having to spend almost half of our development funding on hardware. Today, you don't have to do that. Cloud computing has made it very easy for organizations, individuals, etc., to access compute power from anywhere that they happen to be situated and get the right amount of power for the application that they are trying to push forward or operate, and do it at a reasonable cost. I can really tell you, if I had been able to have cloud computing back 20 years ago, we would have probably had a much greater success rate in the startups that I was in. And you can tell now, me being back in academia, that I didn't end up like Jeff Bezos and start Amazon, unfortunately, or maybe fortunately for the world. Miniaturization. We're talking about sensors. People like to talk about IoT. I talk about the sensors that actually go into the devices. Higher computing power and miniaturization is allowing us to get all of these wonderful little devices to send information that we want, when we want, about what we want. It's a fantastic change from as recently as 20 years ago, when devices were quite big and not that mobile. We're looking at new algorithms as well, because the data has gotten so great that we can now really think about machine learning in a processing capability that is really beyond what we could do 10 years ago. So new algorithms for taking a look at the data. And finally, we're seeing the advances of additive manufacturing. This is an area that I think in the next 10 years will be moving us into the Star Trek world of the replicator. And that's going to be quite interesting for everyone in the supply chain. If you can do on-demand production, that's really Industry 5.0. So these are the trends that we're seeing in technology. Marrying those or facilitating answers, business answers to the trends we're seeing in the greater world at large is where we think that the benefit of digital technology and the advancement of digitalization is going to really come into fruition in the next 10 years. So the digital technologies being married to the problems that industry is facing gets industry executives caught between a rock and a hard spot. They now have the world changing around them from a just macro trend perspective, and then all of this digitalization going on the other side, confusing them about what should we do next, what technologies are going to really be helpful for us, and what are going to be just hyped around and a waste of our time and money. So this is really the conundrum of industry executives today. And hopefully with a few of these examples that I show, we'll see a little bit about how a roadmap for the next 10 years might play out for industry. So let's take a look at that roadmap. Industry response is going to be difficult, but it's going to be pragmatic. So what we are going to see are rational business people looking at hard business cases and coming up with solutions to problems that make sense within their model of how do we make money. This is different than what we tend to think about when we as technology people go out and look at the application of technology. We see opportunity. Businesses have something else in mind. They have problems that they have to solve that better have a payback. We just recently worked on a project with SAP, trying to look at where the promise of technologies that were being made back in the early part of the 21st century, where did they end up here in 2020? And the key finding that we took away is that industry didn't pick up all these technologies, not because they didn't find interesting aspects about the technologies, but they couldn't get a good payback out of applying these technologies. And that sort of makes us very, very clear in how we look forward about digital technology being applied in industry. And that is, there better be a payback to the technology, a problem that is getting solved, and something then that causes industry to buy in this new whatever it is. Okay, so keep that in mind as we go through this. We believe that the technologies that are going to be implemented over the next 10 years in industry on a large scale are advanced analytics, additive manufacturing, the Internet of Things or sensor-based technologies, artificial intelligence, robotic automation, and virtual and augmented realities, as well as the big push by companies like Tesla, but also more importantly by the trucking industry, autonomous vehicles. So other technologies like blockchain or the digital twins that you might hear about in the press today, we think that they are going to have a niche market that they can serve, but they're not going to be picked up en masse like we think these other technologies will be. So let me talk about each one of those technologies independently. So advanced analytics, we've talked about big data for 20 years now. Well, today, people are beginning to see the value of taking a look deeply into the data that they are already generating, as well as being able to marry it with other data that they can get out in the web and come up with new insights for their business. We're seeing this coming about in almost every industry that we have speaking with. and that we are working with today. So advanced analytics is going to be a game changer for many, many companies as they understand better their supply base, their customer base, and they can come up with better ways of looking at how do we meet supply with, I should say, supply with demand. We're very excited about this area. Not only because it requires our students to have a good analytic background, which is something we push them into, if you will, here at the university, but because industry is finally realizing that data means something to them. So we're quite excited by this. Additive manufacturing is becoming something other than simply we'll make one piece and look at it from an engineering perspective. It's actually becoming a very, very productive way of building out parts for repair operations. And it's getting far more sophisticated in the type of devices it can actually manufacture. So we're thinking that over the next 10 years, this is going to become the hot area for companies. The velocity now, or the speed that you can print things, is increasing quite dramatically. And what you can print. I have a little picture on this slide of a large, what looks like overhead crane, printing a house. We can print houses, bridges are being printed, the structures that go into the bridge. I think over the next 10 years, we will see some very exciting things happening here that industry is going to pick up on, and we're going to have, as supply chain professionals, an opportunity to rethink about how we source various components in our supply chain. So this is another area that I think is going to be very, very interesting to industry in the next 10 years. If we look at the Internet of Things, this is, to me, the potential, if you will, for us to get the holy grail that we've been seeking in supply chain as supply chain managers over the last 30 years. And that is end-to-end visibility to our supply. We just today don't have that. No matter what anyone says, there's always gaps in how we can see what we see in our supply chain because we don't have instrumentation in those gapped areas. With the IoT revolution, if we can ever get to standards, we will see these gaps going away. And that will lead to this ability then to really answer the question of where's my stuff? And this is a question that just sits out there all the time. And this will be a huge, huge game changer for the industry. There's also a ton of other aspects that IoT brings in. The idea of mobility, machine-to-machine conversations, vehicle-to-vehicle, vehicle-to-infrastructure. It's a big, big, huge benefit to supply chain professionals and for controlling the flow of goods. I think this will be a major, major game changer for everyone. If we take a look at AI, we also have another thing here to ask ourselves. How smart do you have to be called to go away from being called artificial just to be called intelligent? Devices are becoming extremely intelligent. Certainly from a computational perspective, machines are smarter than we are. They can compute much, much faster. And we're going to see this continue into the future. Intelligent objects, intelligent algorithms, intelligent machines. These things are going to help us remove drudgery tasks from our day-to-day work. They're going to have an impact, unfortunately, on back office operators, but at the same time, they're going to improve the performance of back office activities. They're going to help us with many, many problem identification aspects of business. So we're looking at AI as being a major player in the game going into the future. By the way, AI is a component of smart robotics. It's a component of autonomous vehicles. So it's not an independent thing. It works in all of these categories and activities. So AI, robotic automation, the drudgery and the safety related issues associated with warehousing, trucking, piloting vehicles. We're seeing a lot of different aspects of problematics here that have been exposed even further through the pandemic. Companies are looking at the concept of applying robotics to remove those safety-related issues, to replace actually workers that we no longer can find, and to aid workers who are actually working in hazardous areas by providing them augmentation. So we see a small picture here of a exoskeleton that helps workers in lifting and making sure that they don't have strains and stresses when they go home at night from a day of activity in a heavy lifting type of a job profession. So we're looking at robotics getting to the point where a lot of different things are going to benefit what I call the transaction businesses that we see today having to be performed by human beings. I'm even thinking that by the end of this decade, we'll see lights out facilities far more common than we have in the past, and ones that are far more flexible. So another area that we think has a large impact for industry over the next 10 years. Virtual and augmented reality as aids to workers, technicians repairing things, people in warehouses understanding where something is stored, what is being required to be picked, and in being able to just frankly meet with one another. Virtual reality and augmented reality are going to become major beneficial support functions in industry. We're going to go away as well from these big goggles that we see people having to wear today to more glasses like I have to wear anyway, where we embed the computing capabilities and the projection capabilities into the actual frames of the glass. And we can then truly be in a virtual environment without having to think too much about wearing weird looking headsets, etc. We're also going to see tactile enhancements so that we actually feel as if we're in that virtual environment. We may become like Arnold Schwarzenegger in the movie Total Recall, where instead of going somewhere, we simply embed in our head an image of having been there and enjoying ourselves in that space. Let's see. I don't think we'll quite get there in this decade, but that's sort of where things are going. Autonomous vehicles, the last item on the list, is probably the one that we will see change industry the most over the next 10 years. The reason or at least our industry of supply chain operations, because we can no longer find individuals who will drive the vehicles like we currently have, the long haul truckers. We can no longer find pilots for our ships or for our aircraft for cargo movement. We can no longer find engineers for our trains. So we need to somehow come up with ways to build intelligence into these types of vehicles so that they can operate autonomously and bring the benefits of all the things that we enjoy in supply chain, continue to bring those benefits to all of us. We're also going to see autonomous vehicles most likely take over the last mile problem that we have today, where we have just a cacophony of different types of vehicles, different types of mechanisms to do last mile delivery, where if we simply had autonomous vehicles that could be programmed to handle this, we would see a great reduction in the amount of stress that the neighborhoods have to go through for delivery of all of the things we want to buy on the internet. So these are great things. Technology holds out a lot of benefit for us over the next decade, but we need to also be pretty aware that there are some constraints out there. Constraints mean that we have to change. We have to move from the technologies that we currently have, our back office systems, et cetera, to a new set of systems in the future. That means that our ICT organizations, our computing teams have to up their skills. It means that we as users of technology have to sometimes change our thinking about how we want to use technology and what we are willing to do with technology. It means we as academics have to train our students to deal with a technical world that just 10 years ago didn't exist. These are areas that are constraints on our ability to lift this technology up and see it deployed in a manner that really does bring back the benefits that it holds the potential to bring to us. We also need to think about the Tower of Babel. Right now, technology is evolving so fast that standards are not being established. And we cannot communicate by having multiple different approaches to our communications technologies, our data structures, et cetera. So standardization is another major area that will need to be pushed out and into the real world, if you will, if we are going to get all of the benefit out of the technologies that we think we can get. So keep in mind, we need to be very, very much aware of these, what I would call constraining factors, because they will get in the way. But technology still has a lot that it's holding for us as benefit. We need to think about it in a pragmatic manner, understand business case that it's going to address, make sure it has a return on our investment, that we can commit to building out a digital infrastructure for our companies, and that we have the proper resources available to do that. Otherwise, what we're going to have is this wonderful little curve that's shown on this last graph of mine, the classic Gartner hype cycle, where everyone just is excited as heck about digitalization in the world. only to find that they fall off the cliff into the valley of despair because they can't get it implemented. So let's make sure as you go forward through the rest of the number of planned events that CILT has for you in this digital domain, that you always keep the idea in mind of what's my business case? How much resource do I have to commit to this? And how committed am I to digitalization? So with that, I'd like to end my PowerPoint presentation and my discussion and open it up to the floor for questions.
Thank you, Rod. Well, we've already got some questions coming in, and I'm the question master, so I'll be looking to run through those. And we typically like to focus on your questions. So as we speak, can I just encourage you to put any particular questions you've got into the Q&A? I can see those live, and Rod and I can have a chat around those. Mm-hmm. Unfortunately, we don't open up the floor simply because of that tends to take us into various tests on technology if we do. But one day we may be able to do that.
Well, one of the things that I always tell people is that as advanced as all of the technologies seem to be, they are still very fragile. And we need to understand that as users of technology. They are not quite as, let's call it, idiot-proof as we would like them to be, and they are not quite as robust. There are fragile areas in all of these technologies. They get better as we go forward into the future and we break them enough that people figure out how to fix these gaps in robustness. But we all need to be aware that promise, hype, etc., sometimes don't quite meet at reality.
Yes, I think, and I think, Rod, that really came through in what you were speaking about when you certainly, it was very interesting. I think there's some few questions on the adoption side and some few surprises in your list, which I know one of the questions sort of tested and asked. But it is these restraining factors, isn't it? I think you call them constraining factors, barriers to adoption, whether that be as anybody who's operated in a supply chain environment, it's all right talking about the concept and the idea, but you've got to make the business case, haven't you? And then you spoke about the ability to change and adapt. So you've got to bring the business and the people and the operators into a new environment, and that's there's skills related to that, aren't they? Mm-hmm. So there's a lot there, but I'd like to get straight into the first question, which is really so I think many people would have expected, so simply because of hype, I think, as much as anything else, but there might be other comments from this, but blockchain to be on your list. I think you referred to that blockchain as a solution fills certain niches as you were going through. But the question from Sam Watford here is blockchain close to becoming a useful, widely used technology in the supply chain?
For areas like where you need real security, privacy, and trust, you can use a blockchain solution. The problem with blockchain or any what I would call peer-to-peer model is that it's difficult to map to the plug-and-play requirements that you generally have in a supply chain. In other words, once you get people hooked into the blockchain concept, whatever it is for, you need some stability. Otherwise, the dynamics are such that the cost benefit doesn't pencil out for that technology. So what we're seeing is people trying to experiment with blockchain and coming back and saying, well, it worked well for this application, but it doesn't transfer well into the next application I have, because I have different partners and they all now need to get onto it. And this is the biggest problem you have with it. Again, I go back to it will play a major part. I just don't think it's going to be the revolution that everyone has said. There's also the issue that blockchain by itself is just a stupid database. We need to remember that. You have to layer software on top of that, whether you call that smart contracts or some other kind of application. And that, again, confuses people. People just say, can't I just go and distribute a blockchain? Well, yeah, but what do you get with blockchain? Nothing. You get a flat file database that's secure. You have to have some layer on top, and that means you have to have people who are writing code. And again, we have a situation of, what code do you put on top, and do you want to continually write code for every different application? So here we see a use, but we don't see what I would call the huge deployment that we do in the other technologies that I mentioned.
Mm. And Rod, I think that's really interesting and well articulated in terms of the fact that you've got to have willing partners, so that those partners can be across different businesses, different companies. There's a follow-up question here from again on blockchain, which from Namal Bandaranaike, who's actually saying traceability, considering traceability is a major concern, why don't you see blockchain being or becoming a mainstream technology? So traceability, obviously, some of the factors that we've had in the pandemic in the last 18 months would suggest that actually traceability is becoming more important. Do you think that's something that would unlock it and drive it more into common usage? Or
well, certainly for items that are that require a very, very clear provenance, blockchain is a very good solution. I mean, what blockchain does is it gives you non-repudiation, a good, secure non-repudiation system. So provenance is a classic application that needs a good non-repudiation system. And, I've participated in blockchain for the last almost 7 years in different aspects of application, all of which have been focused clearly on the issue of provenance. Can you show me clearly that this coffee comes from a plantation that is using organic farming techniques? Can you show me clearly that this meat came from a cattle facility that was not abusing its animals, and these types of things? So for those applications, yes. But if what we're doing is looking at the vast majority of shipments, their IoT in general is going to be a much bigger solution to the issue of visibility, because you don't need the tight provenance, and you don't have to put in another layer which you would have to do if you were going to implement a blockchain solution beyond the current visibility tools and sets that most people have already implemented.
Good. No, thanks. Thanks to Namal for that question. I've got, in fact, there's a couple of questions for Panagiotis, who it would take us into some different territory here. I think this is interesting territory. So he says that Rod mentioned that we will be seeing a lot more barriers to cross-border trade in the forthcoming years. Mm-hmm. And actually, I think we probably recognise that we're seeing a lot more barriers in the last few months, to, whether that be shortage of containers or whether that be more nationalistic sort of trade policies like Brexit, or there's other examples like that, or even routes. The Suez Canal, we didn't ever realise could be a blockage to global trade, but has been. And he's saying, what is the future of global trade? So that's quite a broad question, but tackling that from a technology viewpoint, Rod, what's your thoughts on that?
Well, from a technical perspective, I mean, I think we're going to continue to see during this 10-year period tensions. So that basically says that there'll probably be little trade barriers popping here or something here. What that means from a digital perspective is flexibility, and digital technologies allow you to become more flexible in how you manage your supply chain. Now, if you're producing in a country and they blockade the border, you're not going to have much opportunity to be flexible, because whatever you were sourcing in that country is just not going to be able to exit it. But what I'm talking about is, today we have major trade lanes that are potentially blocked by environmental issues because of weather or something else. And historically, we have not been able to really dynamically reroute things. We've come into situations where a volcano goes off in Iceland, for example, and the biotech industry in Ireland is almost shut down because people can't reroute quickly enough. Well, dynamic routing and rerouting is a very big benefit of digitalization and having instrumented shipments, so that you can see where your stuff is and say, okay, at the next stop, we need to offload and move it in this direction because the pathway that we had originally thought through the Suez Canal is blocked, or we have a typhoon in the Far East. Some aspect is requiring us to change. And that's where digital technologies will help.
Yeah, so it could really tackle some of those, issues that in the past really haven't been, but could do that electric. Because I think it's fascinating, isn't it? I'll give you my experience of my gazebo that I ordered in February for the British summer, which is notoriously short, and didn't arrive until July. And those of you who've lived in Britain realise that the season is then becoming very short. Never discovered what the supply chain issue was, but it was, of course, driven, it was being manufactured in China because of cost. But actually, for the customer, the reliability and the ability to get over some of those pipeline issues or those supply issues is probably more important than ultimately now than cost in some respects. So you are into... There are some new things coming out, I think, that are challenging us, aren't there, Rod, in terms of just looking at how we source, manufacture, and how we then get the goods, and how you inform the customer on that front.
Well, you can see that in the willingness that people are having today in paying the huge rates that ocean as well as air are now charging, and you don't really see that inflation. You see some, but not the huge inflation that you might expect when you look at how container rates are 4 times what they were before the pandemic. I mean, crazy numbers that you're seeing. Which is extraordinary, isn't it, in terms of supply chains that have been very cost focused. There is a question, I'm going further down the list, to Jamie Bradford, who's saying, and Jamie, I think is from CILT in Australia. So he's saying there's an appetite in CILT Australia to provide an avenue to have shipping companies move faster to accept some technologies. For example, an app to allow transfer of empty import to full export users can save considerable empty transport legs. However, shipping companies are reluctant to move to this, to the point that they're closing the door on such opportunities for considerable cost environmental improvement opportunities. Now that's that is a common issue, isn't it, in terms of typically, and it was back into you've got to have a business case, haven't you? Mm-hmm. But what's your thoughts? Are those business cases going to change in terms of the view on technology as we go forward? Well, the answer is yes, because one of the factors I don't mention in my slides is competition. And although indirectly, the question of we are too big to fail, no one's too big to fail. And we're seeing that, you get disruptors like an Amazon or an Alibaba or a JD.com, and the huge retailers are just having a terrible time. They decided they didn't want technology, and suddenly now they're finding that was a bad decision. And we're seeing that in other industries as well. So I think that it's a question of competition pushing the industry in a direction that says, all right, you either pick this up or you're going to go out of business. We also see that, for example, in online booking in the freight forwarding and shipping industry. Until companies like Freightos or Flexport got into the business where everything was done online, everybody just sort of poohed that. That's not something that our customers want. Well, in fact, it is something the customers wanted, that convenience. So now we see all of the majors having online booking platforms. So competition will drive this. Now, and I think that's a theme we'll, I'm sure, be back into in our series. That particularly now there's it's a very changing world out there, isn't it? And some of the questions and some of the assumptions we may have asked even a year ago are now quite different, aren't they, in terms of the answering? And ultimately, it will be competition. It will be one of the issues in the supply chain has been the focus on reducing costs. A lot of the issues around, as Jamie asked, around third-party logistics companies, is that they're run very efficiently with very low margins, and of course that's a barrier to taking on technology if they can still do that without incurring a lot of cost. But competition will probably drive them somewhere else, won't it? Yeah, the problem that we have, it's something that unfortunately we at business schools have sort of driven forward. A business school always teaches that the purpose of a business is to make a profit, and that's absolutely wrong. Profit is simply an accounting number. The purpose of the business is to create value in excess of cost. So if you go and you talk to business people about, please define for me why somebody pays XYZ for your product, they're very, very they find it very difficult to answer that question because they never thought about what's the value that these people are buying from me. And as long as we continue to talk in this idea of cost, we end up putting a ton of money on the table that we could have captured as industry together and improved everything, even for the end consumer, because we would have been increasing value, not reducing cost. The idea of cost reduction is a going out of business model.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, and that takes us into another huge territory, doesn't it, in terms of how do we get that, how do we articulate that as supply chain professionals in a business setting, I think it's. But let's, we've answered a number of questions, I think 6 in total, but there's still 11 out there. So thank you to you all for, I'm going to take us into, there's a number of questions around reshoring. I think taking us into that additive manufacturing. Let's start with a sort of general one from Chufo, who's saying, and please, I will apologize for my pronunciation of people's surnames because I'm sure I get them wrong, but his question is, technologically, all the elements of digitalization are real and expected to grow substantially in this decade. For logistics and supply chain, what will be the possibility and the impact of reshoring of manufacturing base closer to home? So, what?
There will be some reshoring, okay? And that just shortens the supply chain. There's certainly benefit in doing that because the longer the chain, the more opportunity for risk to be injected into it, irrespective of how well it's managed. And therefore you're going to have less risks. But I think that this is another one of these large hyped processes, not because of maliciousness or anything, but we forget that when we move to another region or to another production site, that it's not just us that moves. There is an entire ecosystem that is built around these operations and facilities. And to simply say, okay, I'm going to pick up and move to another location closer to home is to ignore the fact that all of this support operation probably can't pick up. So you're going to have to redevelop all of that if you move closer to home. There's been a number of studies done recently, because this is popular with what I would call a certain faction of governments. And most of these studies come down on the fact that, yeah, certain industries can move around a little bit, but you're not going to see a very big impact because the ecosystems for the vast majority of these industries are just too complex to pick up and move home.
So that's quite that's going to because you spoke, didn't you, in terms of on-demand production, and there's a question here from Joseph Sui who's into that territory and saying that actually that could mean that there may not be a need for the economies of scale, but production. But what you're saying is it's a bit broader than just the actual manufacture, then, Rod.
Well, I mean, when I talk about on-demand production, I'm talking about parts production, okay?
Yes.
There's an ecosystem, even with 3D printing, with additive manufacturing, and that ecosystem is having the company that owns the design, put everything in a CAD and a CAE drawing, a digital format that you can download and therefore print. There's a requirement to have the materials, the liquid materials or the sintered materials, the powdered materials necessary. There's a requirement to have support for the machinery that you have. So there's a lot that has to be in place so that you could do such an on-demand production activity. We just recently did a study with the offshore and onshore wind energy business about what do you think about using microfactories, 3D printing capabilities. And, you know, in the industry, the big thing beyond simply thinking that we hadn't been thinking about this was the next question, which is most of the manufacturers don't have downloadable files so that you could do that even if you wanted to.
Yeah, so some quite significant sort of restrictions in that area. And 3D, just to finish with another just to finish on that particular 3D printing topic, Razak Malik, our president, actually has asked a question. He's making the observation, actually, it's been talked about for a long time, 3D printing, hasn't it? And doesn't seem to have now yet created the sort of prominence or the changes that we might have expected. Whereas when he's making the link with the last mile delivery and autonomy, drones, etc., into that, likely to come into that space. Where do you think, Rod, because you spoke about it as being one of the areas that is likely to make a big impact in the next few years? Do you think it will gradually increase in its acceptability and its place in the supply chain?
Yeah, I look at 3D printing as something that's going to take the place of a lot of this, what I call parts outsourcing that goes on today. I mean, you get castings, you get machined parts from small mom and pop producers here, there, and yonder. And with the advances that have occurred in 3D printing and that continue to roll out into industry, for small batch production, it's now becoming sensible, if people put the files online and you can download them, to actually doing 3D printing. And we see that here in Hamburg, there's huge 3D printing facility at Airbus, where many of the non-seen, if you will, components are being manufactured. Do I think that someone making a production run of 100,000 cars a month are going to go to 3D printing? No, that's not going to probably happen.
No.
But in machine tools and other types of things that are produced on a much smaller scale, yes, I think that replace a significant amount of the manual work that goes on today.
Yeah. That sets it nicely in context, I think, in terms of where we will see the changes, and could it ultimately have impacts on global trade? Couldn't it in those respects? Yeah. I'm going to take us into another area you touched on. Start with which implementation is the question, but I think implementation in answering it will take us into a number of questions. But Warith Al-Karouzi from Oman says, he leads our CILT in Oman, has asked the question, implementation is key to technology adaptation or adoption. What are the key success factors? So what are the key success factors about implementing?
Well, implementation requires commitment. It requires having the capability, the technical capability to implement the technology, which is not necessarily easy. And it requires change management, which is probably one of the hardest aspects, because if you build a neat little technical test area, people will come and look at it and say, that's very interesting. And then they'll go back to their job of doing things the way that they have been doing them, whether it's with spreadsheets or other types of things to get the job done. Then when you come in and you say, well, I have this technical solution, you've got to go and prove it to them, because most technology is not understood, and therefore it's looked at as a black box. And why should I trust it? So you really have to think about not only the technical implementation, but the personal implementation. And that sometimes is left out or is way under prioritized. And I've seen just huge disasters because of that. Not because the idea was wrong or the business problem it was solving was wrong, but because the approach was take it or leave it. And that doesn't.
Yeah, yeah. So that, I mean, I personal experience having been part of a global SAP project, which was implementing warehouse management systems for the first time, and we chose actually an Australian site to do the first global launch, and they had only operated on paper-based systems before, and we were introducing quite up, real leading edge technology. And we just didn't take into account the step that people had to make, so yeah, and I'm sure all of us in the supply chain have got some examples of that in terms of, because it does vary, and you can't make assumptions, can you? You can't make assumptions on these things. There's a related question. We're doing quite well on the questions, but we're still up for close for time. But from Xingning, who's saying, Professor Rob, could you describe what the most promising logistics company will be in the future, and what are the skills and abilities that employees should acquire? So that's quite a big one.
Well, I think that when I look at, I can't tell you what the best logistics company in the future will be. What I can tell you is you're probably not going to see much if you were to look down at the structure that we see today, where we have shippers, we have intermediaries, and then we have customers. You're probably not going to see much change in that. You may see the badges on these companies change because of what I will say next. The skill sets that you will need are going to be dramatically different. You need data analytics capabilities. You need to be somebody that is not afraid to tear into data and look at it and make decisions based upon data, not upon gut feeling, which is what we used to do in the past. I mean, I worked in the industry for quite some time, and we just didn't have the information. So we had to use experience, we had to use hope, and we would, sometimes we used a dartboard because you really didn't know what the heck was going to happen. Nowadays, you're going to have to look at the data because the data is there and it can help you through that. So data analytics skills is one. You also need to be comfortable with digital technology. And that means not comfortable like the kids I see at school every day who bring their mobile phone and then play around with it. And then if you ask them, do you know what's going on behind the screen? Do you know how that stuff works? At least in a general idea. And the answer is no. And if you're going to go and become a digital player, you're going to have to answer, yes, I know what's going on. I don't know how the electrons are being moved. I don't know how they laid the circuits or whatever, but I know that what's going on back there follows a process that, you know, I can get my hands around. So that's another aspect that you have to be comfortable with. And, you know, frankly, the industry requires you to know how things get schlepped around the world. I mean, you know, I talk to people all the time who are wanting to get into the industry. And then I just ask them, well, do you know how things get from China to Hamburg? Do you know all the steps that something has to go through, or even have a concept of all of these steps? And most people don't know all of the reasons or the problems and the information exchanges that have to occur to move something from Wuhan, if you will, to the port of Hamburg.
So another big topic area, actually, isn't it, in terms of for us in the supply chain and being ready, both as professionals and as businesses to be prepared for some big changes. And there's a simple question on standards. What standards do you recommend should be used from Finbar Cleary? Standards is a big area here, isn't it, in terms of digitalization? And potentially the lack of it, I guess.
Well, right now there aren't any standards, so say which one to use. From a, you know, if you look at sensors, for example, the communications process in sensors is almost industry, or I should say manufacturer specific, which is unfortunate. There's work going on in the various standard bodies to try and change that. But today, IoT device communication is very, very difficult to implement. This is something that is being argued out right now by the manufacturers in the auto industry, the trucking industry, because they really know they have to have standards, because a Daimler product has to talk to a VW product, has to talk to a Toyota product. But there are just all sorts of other things going on that are still way problematic, because Cisco, Intel, Microsoft all want their standard. And that's, you know, you got big boys and girls playing this game, and until they sort it out together, it's going to be tough.
No, thanks, Rod. I think we've got time for just a couple more questions. So thank you to everybody. We've now got in the classic position where we're not going to be able to answer all of your questions live, but there is, I think, quite an important question about developed and underdeveloped economies that Joseph Sui has asked. And that it is, so Joseph's saying, how can we avoid a gap developing because of discrepancies between the level of digital infrastructure development in the developed and underdeveloped economies? Do you think digitalization will widen the gap or narrow the gap?
This is a tough one. In the developing nations, you have the benefit that you are all moving to some mobile technology, 4th G, hopefully moving on to 5G. If that continues, then I don't see, because the big thing for digital technologies, there are two things. One is training, knowledge. You got to have capability, if you will, to implement. And the other is to have some sort of communications infrastructure that can handle the volume. If you can get to 5G, then you're starting to get into an environment that has the volumetric capabilities. And that's an important aspect. And then I don't think it's a question of being left behind. If you're in a country, unfortunately, that is not moving into that direction, then there is definitely, as you identify, a problem, because you do need that infrastructure. Otherwise, you can't communicate, and that's really the key.
So something to really, and we will, I'll talk a bit when I just headline the events. We're going to have a particular focus on Africa as in one of our next sessions. So that's quite a critical topic globally. I'll finish up then with just, this will probably take you just into a little summary, Rod, to finish up with. But Kalka Magul from CILT in Pakistan asked, what are the major expected challenges in the adoption of digitalization? Now, I think you've covered that quite well in your presentation, but maybe just finish off with just an overview for us in terms of, as we move forward now, where you see the major challenges as being.
Well, the major challenges are that digitalization takes money, it takes knowledge, and it takes willingness. If you think about a company that has for years run itself relatively paper-based or relatively anachronistic old systems, computer systems, change is required. People don't like to change. So given resources, given knowledge, you're still not going to force people to change. So you also have to change that business model and move your people through that process of acceptance. So all of these are the things that get in the way of any technical advance in an organization. Keith, you talked about SAP. This is the classic, water cooler joke, if you will. Are you going through an SAP implementation? Well, there's nothing wrong with SAP. I mean, it's a piece of software. The problem is that people don't understand that our way of doing business is different than how you're going to have to do business after you implement a piece of software like SAP. And, this gap between expectation, the world's going to be much better when we have SAP, and how I really do my business today, which no one really knows except me, that creates this huge problem. So you get into the future and you find that SAP is a disaster. Well, the SAP is not a disaster. What is a disaster is you didn't understand how you got your job done in the first place, how your people performed, and you thought this giant piece of software was going to somehow replicate all of that. Well, if the giant piece of software could do it, then everybody in the world would do your job just like you, and you would have no competitive advantage.
No, that's very well articulated, and I think has been a theme in terms of asking us really to think seriously that it's not just straightforward as here's a technology and you apply it. It's thinking through how, and thinking through the environment, and thinking through the benefits. And Professor Dr. Rod, thank you so much for. We've had a really enlightening hour and a half. It's incredible to think we've spent 90 minutes on it, but we have. It's really set us up I think you've picked out some of the main things. There is so much in this topic, I think, that we're going to come back to. So can I thank you very much on behalf of CILT for taking the time to deliver that for us and to answer all these questions. So thank you, Rod.
Well, thank you for inviting me, and I hope it's been of use to your members. I think it's a great topic to talk about. So I think you have a great series coming up here, and I hope that the members who are on today come back and listen to the various additional topics that will be discussed. I think you've got a good program set up here.
No, thanks, Rod. And thank you to all those who've patiently stuck with us right the way through those 90 minutes. We've had a very big audience today and people from all around the world in all sorts of time zones. So and thank you for your questions, which have made certainly the last hour or the last 3/4 of an hour really go so quickly. So thank you for posting those. Sorry if we haven't quite answered all of them. But just to flag, we move now further into this program. Within a week, we will be having an interview with Gamu Matarira from a consultancy that's African based. So that will take us into digitalization from an African perspective. So look out for that. That will be released. You can look at that through the website. So we're doing a mix this time of both interviews we do in advance and webinars. And we've got a number of those coming up between now and the end of the year. We're following that interview up with an interview with Professor Ed Sweeney from Aston University. So again, we'll get his perspective on the digitalization within the supply chain. And for members globally, we're looking to produce a bulletin on the topic. So we're looking for we're calling for contributions for that bulletin. Again, look at our website, and if you've got both knowledge and case studies, we'd be very interested to receive those. We'll be publishing that towards the end of the year. So please do contribute from all over the world. That's the strength of, we had, I think, over 80 contributions for our sustainability bulletin. So we're looking to beat that this time if we can, or at least to get very close. So can I, on behalf of everybody, thank you again, Professor Dr. Rob Franklin. Thank you for that informative session. It will be available as the session has been recorded, so will be available from Monday. So Professor Rod has kindly allowed us to also use the slides. So look out for those, and have a good day, however much of it is left for you, wherever you are in the world. So thank you very much, and goodbye.
Bye-bye.